Hello and welcome, dear friends. You've just clicked on a topic that touches the heart of so many of us, especially as we grow older and begin to ask deeper questions about who we are and who we've been trying to be. This is Lotus of Dharma, a channel devoted to sharing timeless Buddhist wisdom in a way that heals, uplifts, and gently awakens the spirit, whether you're new to the Dhamma or have walked this path for decades. I welcome you with gratitude. Now, let's begin with a question that may sound simple, but strikes right at the center of our emotional lives. Have you spent your life trying to be agreeable, helpful, easy to be around, hoping that by keeping the peace, you would be loved? If so, you're not alone. Some people believe that pleasing others is an act of kindness, a spiritual virtue, even a form of compassion. And yes, there is beauty in generosity and selflessness when they arise from a place of clarity and fullness. But others, including many great teachers in the Buddhist tradition, would caution that pleasing others at the cost of your truth is not compassion, it's self-abandonment. Today, we will explore this together, not to judge ourselves, but to better understand, why do we feel the need to please everyone? What does the Buddha actually say about it? And most importantly, how can we love others without losing ourselves? But before we go deeper, may I ask you a small favor? If this topic speaks to you, if it stirs something within, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Lotus of Dharma. Your support gives us the encouragement to continue creating more healing, thoughtful content, and brings the Dharma to more hearts around the world. Now, take a breath. Let's begin our journey inward. Part 1. Why do we please others? Why do we spend so much of our lives trying to be agreeable? Why do we smile when our heart is aching, nod when we disagree, or say yes when every fiber of our being wants to say no? It begins in childhood. Back then, approval wasn't just a bonus, it was survival. A warm smile from a parent meant we were safe. A gentle nod from a teacher meant we belonged. And so we learned, early on, that pleasing others brought praise, attention, and a sense of worth. It worked for a time, but the mind, once conditioned, does not know when to let go of its old strategies. And so we carry this habit with us into adulthood, long after its usefulness has faded. In the Buddha's teaching, this habit of needing approval has a name, tanha, craving. But this is not craving in the way we speak of hunger or desire for a possession. This is the deeper craving of identity, the longing to be someone in the eyes of others, to be seen as good, as kind, as worthy. And when this craving grows unnoticed, we become like leaves in the wind. We change our tone in one room, our opinions in another. We measure our worth by other people's reactions. A raised eyebrow becomes a verdict. A silence becomes rejection. Slowly, without realizing, we abandon ourselves to stay within the good graces of others. But here is the danger. Craving approval is like drinking salt water. The more we seek it, the thirstier we become. You see, there is no end to the minds we're trying to satisfy. One person wants you to be bold, another wants you to be quiet. This one admires your honesty, that one resents it. You twist and turn to match every shape, until one day, you no longer recognize your own. And yet, there is no blame in this. The Buddha did not condemn human nature, he only pointed to its tendencies with compassion. He saw clearly that when we cling to identity, to being liked, needed, respected, we suffer. There is a story of a monk who once asked the Buddha, "Master, what should I do to win the respect of others?" The Buddha replied, "Let go of the wish to be respected, and walk the path sincerely. Respect, if it comes, is only a shadow of your practice, not its goal." This is the essence of the teaching. To please everyone is impossible, but to live truthfully, with compassion, and in harmony with the Dhamma, that is more than enough. We must ask ourselves, do we want to be liked, or do we want to be free? Because often, the cost of being liked by all is the loss of your own peace. And so, if craving approval leads to suffering, where does it come from? What's the deeper layer beneath? Part 2. The root of approval seeking. In the teachings of the Buddha, there is a word that quietly dismantles the foundation of so much of our suffering. Anatta, the doctrine of non-self. To those unfamiliar with it, this might sound like a cold or abstract idea, but in truth, it is among the most compassionate teachings ever given, because it liberates us from the exhausting burden of always having to be someone. You see, Most of us spend our lives trying to construct and protect a self. We shape it carefully with our personality, achievements, beliefs, kindness, appearances, and then we defend it, like a house made of glass in the middle of a storm. We try to please others because we fear that without their approval, this self we have built will not survive. So we adjust, we shrink when they disapprove, we glow when they praise. We carry 100 masks, each one tailored to fit the desires and expectations of those around us, and then we wonder why we feel so tired, so scattered, so unknown even to ourselves. But the Buddha, with extraordinary clarity and gentleness, pointed to something deeper. He saw that what we call the self is not a solid thing. It is not a permanent soul encased in a body, nor a fixed identity we can hold up to the world and say, "This is me." Rather, it is a process, a constant unfolding of experience. What we are in any given moment is the coming together of 5 elements: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These 5 aggregates arise and dissolve like waves on the surface of a great ocean. They do not stay still, they do not stay the same, and yet we cling to them as if they define who we are. This clinging becomes even more tangled when we place our sense of self in the hands of others. We let them define us, sometimes with a word, a glance, or the absence of one. We live not from the quiet truth within us, but from the imagined reflections in their minds. We become like an actor so lost in the role that we forget we are on a stage. We perform our goodness, our kindness, our intelligence, not because they flow naturally from the heart, but because we believe they are required for us to be accepted, to be loved, to be seen as worthy. And here is where suffering quietly begins, because when we build our identity on approval, we also build it on sand. It shifts with every opinion, every judgment, every change in the wind. The self we present becomes a performance, and every audience demands a different script. One day, someone praises our generosity, we feel worthy. The next, another calls us selfish, we question our entire character. A third person disagrees with our choices, and suddenly we feel as though we've failed not just them, but ourselves. But who is this self that rises and falls with each wave of praise or blame? Who is this fragile creature we are trying to protect? The Buddha would smile gently and say, "It is not who you are. You are not the roles you play. You are not the stories others tell about you. You are not even the fears you carry in the quiet corners of your mind. Beneath all of that is something untouched, something still, awareness itself. Not the thoughts that swirl above, not the emotions that rise and fall, but the space in which they all unfold. That awareness does not crave applause. It does not shrink when insulted. It does not swell when praised. It simply witnesses, calm, clear, and untroubled. And this is the truth that can free us from the endless cycle of approval seeking. We are not the image others see, nor the mask we wear to please them. We are the silence behind the performance, the stillness beneath the noise. When we understand this, not just with the mind but with the marrow of our being, we begin to relax. We stop bending ourselves into unnatural shapes. We stop watering down our truth for the comfort of others. We begin to live, not as a polished version of ourselves, but as we are, tender, changing, human, and from that honest place, true compassion can finally flow. Because pleasing others to protect our self-image is not compassion, it is fear in disguise. But when we act from awareness, from freedom, we give without attachment, we love without fear, and we speak our truth with gentleness. This is what the Buddha meant when he spoke of liberation, not some distant mystical event, but the everyday miracle of no longer needing to be someone in order to be enough. But what happens when we ignore this truth, when we continue chasing approval? Pretending, performing, pleasing, even as something inside us begins to fade. That is where we must go next, because there is a quiet cost to losing yourself in the eyes of others. And that cost is deeper than most people realize. Part 3. The danger of losing yourself. It is often said that people burn out from doing too much, from the endless lists, the heavy responsibilities, the constant demands of modern life. But that's only part of the story. In my experience, people don't truly burn out because they're busy. They burn out because they're disconnected from themselves, from their values, from their truth. It's not the weight of the work that exhausts the soul. It's the weight of wearing the life that doesn't quite fit. I remember a woman who once came to speak with me. She was in her early 60s, kind eyes, gentle smile, the sort of person who you could tell had spent her whole life being kind to others. But her voice trembled as she spoke. She said, "I've always tried to be a good daughter, a good wife, a good mother. I've always done what was expected of me. But now, my children are grown, my husband is gone, my parents have passed, and I find myself sitting in a quiet house, asking a question I never thought I'd had to ask. Who am I?" There was a silence between us, not awkward, just full of years she had given away in pieces, full of the quiet grief of a life lived entirely for others. And perhaps most of all, full of the deep realization that kindness without clarity can become a kind of disappearance. This is the quiet tragedy of people pleasing. It does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, over time, like water dripping from a vessel. You give a little here, you bend a little there, and soon enough you have shaped yourself so much to fit the needs of others that you no longer remember the original shape of your own soul. And yet, society often calls this noble. We praise those who are selfless, who put everyone else first. But there is a vast difference between genuine compassion and chronic self-abandonment. One arises from fullness, the other from fear. The Buddha once said, "You yourself, as much as anyone in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." It sounds simple, but for many people, especially those raised to equate goodness with obedience, it is a revolutionary idea. You deserve your own care. You deserve your own presence. You are not here merely to orbit the lives of others. Serving others is beautiful when it comes from a place of presence. But when we forget ourselves completely in that service, it is no longer compassion, it becomes self-erasure. True compassion includes yourself. In fact, if it excludes you, it isn't whole. There is nothing noble about losing your own voice so others can speak more loudly. There is nothing wise about erasing your needs so others can feel more comfortable. To forget yourself in the name of love is not love, it is a form of quiet violence. And the wound it leaves is not loud or dramatic, but it runs deep. It shows up in the quiet hours, when the house is empty and the mirror reflects not your face, but your emptiness. So ask yourself gently, with compassion, is the life I am living my own, or is it someone else's version of who I should be? Because if you cannot find yourself in the life you built, then it is time not to blame anyone, but to return to the path that brings you back to your center. Still, some may wonder, isn't saying no selfish? Doesn't the Dharma teach us to be selfless, to give, to serve, to love without limits? Yes, but not without wisdom. Because even the Buddha, with his infinite compassion, knew when to say no, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. Part 4. Stories from the Buddha when he said number. There is a story preserved in the Pali Canon, quiet in its presence, yet profound in its teaching. A man once approached the Buddha, not with reverence, but with hostility. He came not to listen, but to challenge, to provoke, to throw words like spears into the calm of the awakened one's presence. He raised his voice, he hurled insults, he tried to stir anger, to fracture serenity. But the Buddha remained still. He did not reply, he did not react, he simply listened fully, silently. When the man had exhausted himself, when the last harsh word had left his lips and hung in the air like smoke, the Buddha spoke with a voice as soft as morning rain. He said, "If someone offers you a gift, and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man, caught off guard by the unexpected question, replied, "To the one who offered it." Then, said the Buddha, "I do not accept your anger. It stays with you." There is no shouting in this story, no confrontation, no dramatic triumph, just clarity, just a simple truth, calmly delivered, a boundary drawn not with resistance, but with presence. That moment was the Buddha's no, not cold, not unkind, but deeply rooted in awareness. This is important. The Buddha did not bend to please. He did not absorb the man's anger to avoid conflict. He did not dilute his own clarity for the sake of keeping the peace. Instead, he responded with firmness wrapped in compassion. He drew a line, not to protect his ego, but to protect the Dharma, the truth. And this is a lesson we often overlook when we think about compassion. Many people assume that to be compassionate means to say yes to everything. That to be spiritual is to always agree, always give, always absorb the needs and emotions of others, even at the expense of one's own well-being. But this is a misunderstanding. Compassion does not mean abandoning yourself to be light. It means acting from wisdom, not fear, from presence, not pressure. In that story, the Buddha offered us a model of what wise boundaries look like. They are not sharp or defensive. They are not rigid walls. They are open hands that say, I see your suffering, but I will not take it in unless it is mine to carry. It is the art of letting others feel what they feel, while staying rooted in your own ground. Even in other stories, when someone would ask something unreasonable, or attempt to misuse his teachings for personal gain, the Buddha would often remain silent. Silence, in such moments, was his refusal, his way of saying no without aggression. His boundaries were not loud, but they were unshakable. There was once a monk who tried to twist the Buddha's words to win an argument. Instead of correcting him publicly or appeasing the crowd, the Buddha simply stood, adjusted his robe, and walked away. No rebuke, no effort to defend himself, just the dignity of disengaging from what was no longer in alignment with truth. This is something we can all learn from. Saying no is not unkind if it protects the integrity of your being. Turning away is not harsh if it keeps you from participating in what is false. And silence is not absence when it comes from a place of deep presence. The Buddha's compassion had boundaries because it was not based on guilt or people-pleasing. It was based on insight, the insight that we cannot pour from an empty cup, and that enabling others' delusions is not the same as helping them awaken. To say no in the way the Buddha did is an act of love, love for truth, for peace, and for the sacredness of your own path. It is to honor that true giving must come from fullness, not depletion. This brings us to the heart of it. If we are not meant to please everyone, if even the Buddha said no when it was wise to do so, then what does genuine giving look like? How can we help, serve, and love others without losing ourselves in the process? Let us explore that next. Part 5. The Wisdom of Right Intention. In the Eightfold Path, which the Buddha offered as a map to liberation, there is one step often overlooked, not because it is small, but because it is quiet. Samma Sankappa, or right intention. Right intention is not about doing more. It's not about saying all the right words or performing the right actions. It is about pausing before you act, before you speak, even before you give, and asking yourself one honest question: why? Because in Buddhism, the motivation behind the action matters as much as the action itself. When we give, whether it's our time, our attention, our energy, we often assume that giving is always good, but the truth is more subtle than that. Giving is beautiful only when it comes from clarity and compassion. When it comes from guilt, or fear, or a desire to be liked, then it is no longer generosity, it is a form of self-protection dressed in kindness. I have seen this so often. A woman says yes to another request, even though she is exhausted, even though something inside her says no. She smiles and helps, but her heart is tight, and later, she feels resentment. She wonders why no one ever sees her limits. She wonders why giving leaves her feeling more invisible, not more connected. But the problem is not with the giving. The problem is with the intention behind it. When we say yes from fear, fear of disappointing someone, fear of not being loved, fear of seeming selfish, we are not offering love. We are offering fear, and fear cannot nourish another person. It cannot sustain a relationship. It can only create more confusion. The Buddha understood this with great compassion. He never asked us to become martyrs. He never asked us to sacrifice our own integrity to maintain harmony. He asked us to become aware, to look within and ask ourselves, softly but sincerely, am I doing this because it's true for me? Or am I doing it because I'm afraid to upset someone else? That is right intention. It is not about being right in the eyes of others. It is about being aligned inside and out. When your actions match your values, when your speech reflects your heart, when your yes is wholehearted, and your no is peaceful. A monk gives with an open palm, not with a clenched fist hidden inside the robe. So must we, because true giving, the kind that heals both the giver and the receiver, does not come from duty or pressure. It comes from presence, from fullness, from a place inside you that is already whole and simply wishes to share. And when we give from that place, when we say yes because it is true, and no because it is wise, then everything becomes lighter. The act is free of resistance. The heart is not divided. There is no bitterness, no fatigue, no secret tally of sacrifices. This is not selfishness, this is clarity. It is the wisdom to recognize that what we offer is sacred and must not be given in fear or frustration. Still, some may wonder, what does this look like in everyday life? How can we live with right intention, not in a monastery? Not wrapped in robes, but right here, in our messy, noisy, complicated lives? Part 6. How to set boundaries mindfully. In this world, we often confuse boundaries with selfishness. We believe that to be loving is to be endlessly available, endlessly agreeable, endlessly giving, even when we feel tired, unheard, or quietly resentful. But that is not love. That is self-abandonment in disguise. In the Buddha's way, there is a deeper understanding. Boundaries are not walls. They are the sacred spaces where you end and another begins. They are the quiet lines we draw to protect not only ourselves, but also the honesty and clarity of our relationships. A life without boundaries is like a house without doors. Everything comes in, and eventually, everything is taken. Setting a boundary does not mean you care less. It means you care deeply enough to be honest. It means you are no longer willing to betray your own truth in order to keep the peace on the surface. True peace cannot come from pretending. It only comes from presence, from living in alignment with your values. You may be wondering how to begin. The next time someone asks something of you, your time, your help, your energy, try this practice. Before responding, pause. Place a gentle breath between the request and your reply. Let your mind settle, just enough to ask 3 quiet questions. Is this kind? Is this wise? Is this true to me? Not just kind to the other person, but kind to you. Not just wise in appearance, but wise in your heart. Not just a surface-level truth, but a deeper integrity. If the answer to any of these is no, then you are being invited not to reject, not to resist, but to speak clearly, kindly, and with compassion. You might say, I love you, but I cannot do this right now. Not because you love them less, but because you're choosing to love both of you at the same time. This is a practice. It takes courage, especially for those of us who have spent a lifetime defining ourselves by how useful, generous, or agreeable we are to others. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. You may feel guilt rise like a wave, but in that moment, remember this. Saying yes when you mean no is not kindness. It is dishonesty coated in sweetness. And dishonesty, no matter how polite, builds walls between hearts. By contrast, a boundary set with mindfulness and love becomes an act of connection. It says, this is where I am. I want to meet you here, honestly, and over time, those who truly care for you, not just your usefulness, will honor that truth. Boundaries are not meant to separate us. They are meant to reveal us, to bring forth the part of ourselves that no longer hides, no longer performs, no longer says yes out of fear. And from that place, real relationships can begin. Now comes perhaps the hardest truth of all. When we stop pleasing others just to be accepted, we may lose people. Some will drift away, confused or disappointed by your honesty. But in that quiet space they leave behind, something else begins to grow, something precious. We begin, at last, to find ourselves. Part 7. Being loved versus being true. There's a quiet fear that lives in many of us, a fear we rarely speak aloud, but one that shapes how we show up in relationships, in families, in communities. It whispers in the background of our choices. If I stop being agreeable, will I still be loved? It's a tender question, one that reaches all the way back to childhood, when love often felt conditional, when we learned that being good, being polite, helpful, pleasing, earned us affection, while expressing anger, sadness, or resistance could lead to withdrawal or silence. So we adapted, we shaped ourselves into what others needed us to be, and slowly, we confused being liked with being loved. But there comes a point on the path, whether through age, suffering, or awakening, when the soul begins to rebel against this quiet arrangement. It starts to whisper a different question, more honest, more painful. If I had to betray myself to be loved, is it really love? True love does not demand your silence. It does not ask you to shrink, to nod when you disagree, to stay when your heart says go. Love that only exists when you comply is not love. It is control wrapped in affection. We see this so clearly in the life of the Buddha. He was born into a palace, into privilege, into a life where everything had been arranged to keep him comfortable. agreeable, safe, but inside, he felt the truth stirring, the truth that suffering could not be escaped by pretending it didn't exist, or by keeping others happy. So he left, not in rebellion, not to hurt those who loved him, but because truth was calling. He walked away from approval, from duty, from expectation, not out of selfishness, but out of clarity, because deep within, he knew he was not born to be someone's idea of a good son, a good prince, a good man. He was born to awaken, and so are you. You are not here to decorate someone else's story. You are not here to be pleasing at the cost of your peace. You are not here to be a character in someone else's dream. You are here to wake up, to lie from truth, to speak with love and honesty, to disappoint others, yes, when necessary, but never to disappoint your own soul. And here's the paradox: when you begin to live in truth, you may lose the conditional love of a few, but you will gain something far greater, the unshakable love that arises within when you no longer abandon yourself. You will begin to attract relationships that honor your fullness, not just your usefulness, people who want to know your truth, not just your compliance, and those who cannot stay in the presence of your truth. Let them go with kindness. They were not meant to walk the entire path with you. The Buddha did not awaken by being agreeable. He awakened by being free. So walk your path, say what is true, lie from your center, because the love that is worth having will never ask you to leave yourself behind. As we come to the end of this reflection, I invite you to sit quietly with everything we've shared. You've walked with me through the craving for approval, the illusion of self, the quiet burnout that comes from betraying your truth, and the gentle strength it takes to say no without guilt. We've seen that even the Buddha, the embodiment of compassion, did not try to please everyone. He stood firmly in truth and invited us to do the same. So if today you are feeling weary from the weight of always trying to be agreeable, if your heart is tired from performing roles instead of simply being, may this be the beginning of a new kind of love. One that includes you, one that honors your truth, one that gives not from fear but from freedom. You are not here to decorate someone else's life. You are here to awaken. And that awakening begins when you stop asking, "Do they approve of me?" and start asking, "Is this true for me?" Before you go, if this message has touched something inside you, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might be silently struggling, and subscribe to Lotus of Dharma for more teachings like this, drawn from the heart of Buddhist wisdom. May you walk gently on your path. May you speak with clarity, give with presence, and lie from the stillness that needs no applause. Until next time, be well, be true, and be free.